Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Factory Reset Podcast. My name is Tommy, and this podcast is all about how the church can be a spotless bride for Jesus Christ. This is the second in a series of episodes about the topic of divorce and remarriage, what Jesus had to say about it, and what it means for us. In the last episode, I talked about our need to keep focused on God as our treasure. If we do not see that He is our real soulmate, that He is the real love of all of our lives, then we will not have the strength or the motivation even to be objective as we think through some of the difficult things Jesus taught. If when the rubber meets the road, our hope is actually in this life, then we will inevitably explain away much of what Jesus said in order to avoid carrying our own cross and losing our lives for Him in this world in whatever way we may need to. In this episode, I would like to tell the first part of my own story in regards to divorce and remarriage. Specifically, I want to tell you about a horrifying night that I had alone in a really nice hotel room back in December of 2015. I'm not going to get into too many of the details of my own marriage situation. It's a long story, and the details aren't really relevant to this topic. What I want to focus on more is what happened after my marriage came to an end. But I do want to tell you some of what happened leading up to my divorce. I'm not going to say this to try to make my wife sound like the bad guy. I don't blame her for regretting that she had married me. I don't think she should have left, but I think she had legitimate reasons to want to leave. But I tell this part of the story so that you will understand part of the reason why I and everyone around me just assumed that I could remarry after she left. And if anyone listening to this has some questions about my story after hearing this, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to share with you more of the details of what happened and why. Happy to answer questions and let people probe. That doesn't bother me at all. Just it's too long of a story, and it's not necessarily relevant. So I got married in June of 2014, 2 years after meeting my wife. We lived in Maine, where I had been part of a conservative evangelical church for quite some time. And then she left very suddenly at the end of March of 2015 after about 9 months of marriage. In the aftermath of her leaving and divorcing me, I felt very free to remarry, especially because of the way that she had ended things. I had been watching pornography. I'd been emotionally unavailable to some degree due to that addiction to pornography. I had not loved and cared for her like I should have. She had good reasons to be deeply unhappy in our marriage. And there were other pretty serious problems that I didn't fully understand or wasn't fully aware of at the time. And I think that if I had not been addicted to pornography, and if I had therefore been able to connect with her in a certain way, if I had been more in tune with where she was really at, if I had been a better friend to her in that season, then things could have gone very differently. At the same time, she left without any discussion or notice. I had no idea she was going to leave until she was gone, and then she would not respond to my efforts to contact her. And so it was a very unusual situation, and this is what some people in our culture call ghosting. Ghosting somebody where you just disappear. And for me, it was more strange and disorienting than it was painful. It was like I was living in an episode of The Twilight Zone. And so maybe you can see why the folks in my church and in my life were encouraging me and telling me how unfair this was and that I would meet somebody else someday, things like that. Because in spite of how I had sinned against my wife and how I had failed to love her, everybody saw me as the victim of abandonment. Everyone felt bad for me since she left in the way she did. Because I confessed my pornography addiction to her. and we were trying to work it out. We definitely needed counseling for that, issues and others. There were actually bigger, deeper problems, in my opinion, in our relationship that needed to get worked out. As far as I knew, we were both committed to getting through that stuff. But then she was just gone after only 9 months. And so everybody who counseled and helped me after she left and after it seemed clear that she was not coming back told me that I could remarry. And I think that's partly because of how unjust the situation seemed to everybody. Whereas if I had been having an affair with another woman, if I had been beating her or something, if I had divorced her for no reason other than that I just didn't want to be married anymore, then of course people probably would have been telling me that I needed to repent and not that I could remarry. But in this situation, everybody felt that I was eligible for remarriage, and I totally agreed with that. And I would have counseled someone else in my situation in the same way. And maybe you agree. Maybe you would have counseled me or somebody like me in the same way and said, of course you can remarry. I mean, is this guy who's only in his early 30s, who struggles with sexual temptation, is he really supposed to be single and celibate because his wife abandoned the marriage because of some issues they could have worked through if she had just stuck it out a little longer? No, that couldn't be right. Tommy shouldn't be doomed to singleness because of something like that. That couldn't be God's will for his life. Surely he gets a do-over. Surely he gets another shot at this marriage thing. Not one person in my entire network of conservative Christian friends, which included multiple church communities and parachurch organizations, not one person suggested that maybe I needed to be single and celibate and wait for my wife and pray for reconciliation. Nobody suggested that it could be out of line with Jesus' teachings for me to remarry. Not one person. Not until a very cold, dark night in late December of that year in St. Louis, Missouri. I was in St. Louis for the last few days of December because I was attending a huge evangelical missions conference called Urbana. The Urbana conference happens every 3 years typically. 20,000 people, huge stadium, big hotels, very exciting event with lots of amazing music and speakers and all kinds of interesting seminars about missions and evangelism. It goes on for 4 or 5 days, and then everybody goes home on New Year's Day. This event is put on by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. InterVarsity is a very big college ministry organization, much like Campus Crusade for Christ. Amazingly, I had started working for InterVarsity several months after my divorce. It was unusual for them to hire someone who has just been through something like that. But I had a very good friend who worked for InterVarsity at the time, who was willing to vouch for me. He knew that I was serious. I really did want to serve God. He felt bad for me because of what had happened. He wanted to see my life go in a positive direction. He had an open slot on his ministry team there in Maine, and he'd be able to keep a close eye on me. And I also had a history with InterVarsity. I had worked and volunteered for them in the past for several years, and so he pulled some strings for me and he got me hired. And so there I was at Urbana 2015, about 8 months after my wife had left. You may have heard some of my story about this Urbana conference in one of my previous videos or episodes. If you haven't, very quickly, I met a group of guys there who seemed to be picketing the conference. They were holding signs outside of the stadium that had things Jesus said on them. They were trying to persuade evangelicals at the conference to take the teachings and commandments of Jesus more seriously. And I had a number of very challenging and eye-opening discussions with a few of these guys, and here is one of them. One night I was walking between the stadium and the hotel that I was staying at, and I run into some of these guys. And the sign they were holding that night said something like, divorce and remarriage equals adultery. So I stopped to talk. I felt quite confident that divorce and remarriage did not equal adultery, at least not in many cases, certainly not in my case. But this man holding the sign insisted that no, if you marry someone while your first spouse is still alive, it's always adultery. Now, by this time in the conference, these guys already had my attention. I had already spoken with them a few times about a number of topics that week, and I had observed their unusual sobriety and humility and their genuine concern for the people they were talking to. They honestly thought that we evangelicals at the conference were misled about some very important things. And holding signs can seem angry or aggressive at first, but these men were actually quite gentle and calm. They were not screaming over megaphones. They were not unwilling to let other people talk. They were having real, respectful, productive discussions with people. And so my guard was down and I was more than willing to hear them out. But of course, I didn't tell them that I myself was divorced. So after hearing some of their divorce and remarriage spiel, in my ignorance, I confidently tried to reference the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, and I said something like, well, doesn't Paul say that if your spouse leaves you, you can marry whoever you want as long as they are a Christian? And maybe you already know the mistake that I was making there. I was kind of combining 1 Corinthians 7:14 with 1 Corinthians 7:39. Verse 14 says that if an unbelieving spouse leaves, the believing spouse is not enslaved in such cases. It never says they can remarry, but only that they are not enslaved and that they're called to peace. And that could be taken a number of ways, and I'll get into that in another episode, God willing. And verse 39 says that if a woman's husband dies, she is free to marry whoever she wishes, only in the Lord. And so I was revealing my lack of knowledge of the scripture there, sloppily mixing these two verses, and the man gently corrected me. Well, this discussion really got my wheels turning. Nobody had told me what this man was telling me. I don't think I had ever heard this perspective. I had just assumed that remarriage was permitted in a variety of situations. So back in my hotel room, I was ready to do some research. And if I remember correctly, I first looked again at some of the passages where Jesus talks about this issue. And yeah, when I read the words afresh, it did not appear to be nearly as clear as I thought it was that I could remarry. Some of what Jesus said seems to forbid remarriage completely. Matthew 5, Mark 10, Luke 16. Can't remember which of those I looked at that night, but some of it was pretty straightforward. But then there was Matthew 19:9, which seems to allow it, but it's an awkward sentence, the way it's structured, at least in English. Like, how am I supposed to read that exactly? It could be saying that I can remarry if my wife cheats on me, but it's hard to know how to take it when you consider some of the other things Jesus said that seem not to agree with that interpretation. And one complicating factor in all of this is that Jesus never explicitly addressed my specific situation. I didn't divorce my wife, she divorced me. And Jesus didn't explicitly say that whoever is divorced by his wife commits adultery if he remarries. But what he did say was really serious. Maybe he didn't need to hit all the possible angles and individual situations that we can find ourselves in. He doesn't mention anything about domestic abuse or, what if one of the spouses keeps doing heroin or something like that. He didn't say anything about those things either. Well, how does all this come together? What did this mean for me personally? I mean, this is important stuff. I need this to be clear. This is my life. And so this is where I began to panic a little bit. And I got online and I began looking for articles to read on the subject, hoping to find out why, yes, it's quite clear, Tommy, of course you can remarry. But to my shock, there seemed to be some very smart scholars who expressed different opinions. There was not a consensus among the scholars who have really studied this topic. And maybe that should have been obvious, but in my naive mind, I guess I just assumed that everyone knew that we can remarry for a number of reasons. I mean, so many Christians have done it. How could it not be okay, at least in some situations? But now it was sinking in for me that there is a serious biblical case to be made that remarriage is never allowed while the first spouse is alive. That is a legitimate interpretation that can harmonize with all the relevant passages. It could be the correct interpretation. I wasn't convinced that it was correct, but what bothered me was simply that it might be correct. Now, maybe the guys who say that you can remarry were right. Maybe. The problem was that I couldn't know for sure that they were right. Can you remarry in a variety of situations, including abandonment, as I had been taught? Or can you only remarry in one situation if your spouse cheats on you, as some people said? In which case, okay, do I have to wait until my wife committed adultery in order for me to be free to remarry? Do I need to hire a detective or something to find out if she has slept with somebody yet, or if she had remarried somebody else yet? Or was she actually free to remarry since I had watched pornography behind her back, committing sexual immorality, and now I have to stay single while she can have a new marriage? Or, as some more conservative scholars were saying, was it the case that if your spouse is alive, it is always adultery to remarry? You have to be single or reconciled as long as you're both on the planet. That's the teaching of Jesus. Well, these seemed to me at the time to be three possible ways to interpret the teaching of the New Testament. Which one was right? They can't all be right. I'm not a relativist. Many Christians seem to operate like relativists today, that, hey, these are all valid interpretations. Neither one is more right than the other. It's the heart that matters after all. Just go with the one that feels right in your conscience. No. I don't want to know which one I think is right, which one I feel good about. I want to know which of these irreconcilable interpretations is the truth. So I sat there in my hotel room while most of the people at the conference were probably over in the stadium, and I pondered this. And I realized something horrifying. That there was only one way I could know for sure that I was living in obedience to Jesus while my wife and I were both still alive. From my perspective at that moment, if I remarried, that might be okay with Jesus. Because the scholars who say remarriage is allowed by Jesus in a variety of situations, including abandonment, they could be correct. But how encouraging is that really? There I am standing at the altar, about to marry my second wife, and I'm thinking to myself, this might not be adultery. The problem with that, of course, is that it might be adultery, because the scholars who say that remarriage is not allowed, they could be the ones who are right, and they make a good case. But if I stay single and keep my promise to my wife as long as we both shall live, which is what I promised to do in the first place, then I am definitely obeying Jesus. Some scholars would say that remarriage is allowed in one or in a variety of situations, and some will say it isn't ever allowed while the first spouse is alive. But all the scholars would agree, and nobody could deny, that singleness after a divorce is allowed if the other spouse won't reconcile. There would be no danger of disobeying the teaching of Jesus if I did that. Now think about those two options. Option one, get remarried and maybe obey Jesus, but also potentially disobey him and bring someone else into an adulterous relationship that could cost us both our eternal lives if we're wrong. Or option two, if my wife will not reconcile, then stay single while we're both alive and definitely obey Jesus. Remarry and maybe obey, stay single and definitely obey. Well, how could I ever remarry knowing that it could be adultery? I mean, if I went with that option, then what would that say about my heart and my love for Jesus? What would that reveal about how committed I really am to Jesus? I just knew I could never do that. I would need to know, especially with an issue as important as this, that I'm doing the right thing and that it's okay with Jesus. I can't gamble on something like this. Well, this was all very, very disturbing. Was I going to have to be single the rest of my life? How could I do that? I was a recovering pornography addict. I had been masturbating habitually since I was 11 years old. Clearly, I did not have the gift of singleness. And I assumed I would be with someone again at some point, and I wanted to have a family. I wanted my parents to see their grandkids. And I am my father's only son. I am the last male in the Holmes family. If I don't have kids, there will be no more Holmeses. These are some of the thoughts that were immediately shooting through my mind that night as all this sank in. And I felt almost like I had a picture in my mind of the marriage that I wanted and the family that I wanted. And that marriage and that family was starting to disappear, like they may never exist. It was like that dream was evaporating in front of me. All because of a few, at the time, devastating words that came from the mouth of Jesus. Words I knew I had to be sure to obey, whatever they meant. That sword that comes from Jesus' mouth was shredding my dreams that night, regardless of what the right interpretation was. And I curled up on the bed in the fetal position, and I just stayed there for a while, talking to God about it, contemplating the implications, feeling afraid, feeling like I was in a nightmare I hoped I would wake up from, feeling like darkness was closing in around me, feeling like a knife had just been stuck in my gut. And yet at the very same time, I knew that God was there with me in that hotel room. And that's where I'm going to end this episode. I don't want these to be too long, so I'll stop there and I'll pick it up where I'm leaving off in the next one. May God bless you, whoever you are. And please send me a message on WhatsApp at 207-749-1442 if you would like to talk. Thank you.